Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to all of you for coming along this afternoon. So I'm going to reflect today on 25 years on, still work to do. And of course, since the Act is only 10 years old this year, of course things don't arrive fully formed. There has to be a process by which something starts its journey. And I'm sure that when I talk to you about what I feel are the significant points of the process, other people might have views on that as well. I also wanted to frame what I'm going to talk about today through Donella Meadows. Now, many of you will know about Donella Meadows. She wrote Limits to Growth in 1993 and in 1992. And sorry, can I just take that back completely? She wrote Limits to Growth in 1973. I knew nothing about it at the time, never heard of her. And I didn't hear about her till 1992 and the first Earth Summit, which was held in Rio de Janeiro. And when I kind of found out what she thought about, I was really impressed. And she had this whole way of looking at systems thinking, and she'd started developing these ideas. And if anybody here is at the university who hasn't come across her book, Thinking in Systems, I really recommend it. She'd started thinking about systems following Limits to Growth being published in 1973, because the book showed that most countries in the developed world were already using more of the ecological footprint that the world has at that time. And she thought, brilliant woman, she thought that if she told governments that, they would act upon it. Now, we laugh now, but in the 1970s, that was a serious proposition, that if you gave evidence, and that evidence was real and could be checked, then governments would act on it. But of course, by then, we were already well into our 20th century response to the Industrial Revolution, which is take, make, and waste as much as you possibly can, because that is the only way that capitalism is going to run the world. So we end up in a situation whereby most of the government said, thanks, very interesting, very useful, we'll have people look at it. And nothing happened. I mean, there were some really good academic initiatives that happened, not least through Donella and her husband. But when the book was republished 30 years on, so in 2003, and sadly after her sudden and untimely death, Thinking in Systems, the 30-year update, she made very clear that in terms of how you persuade people is not about evidence. How you persuade people is through having a very clear set of ideas, which I've used in the chapters of my book. And the first one is visioning. So I think, taking it, can you all read it from the back, which is the main thing. But look at what she said, taking off the constraints of feasibility, of disbelief and past disappointments, and letting your mind dwell upon its most noble, uplifting and treasured dreams. And every single word in there is important, because this notion of visioning is not how can I get more money, or how can I get more money for my family, or how can I rape the world a little bit better than I'm doing at the moment. This is about having aspirations for the good of the whole of humanity. And she was also very clear that humanity is within nature, not separate from nature. So each of these elements for me has driven how I've reflected on how we in Wales have had the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. For many, and I think this is a kind of, for me this was the major starting point, was when devolution meant that in 1999 we had a new democracy and a new duty for Wales. What you may not realise, unless you've studied the history of the National Assembly, is we came in as a new democracy with a tiny vote in our favour and virtually no powers. So we had effectively 60 new politicians, all of whom wanted to change the world, but without the structures that would enable them to change it. Of course, Wales now has primary lawmaking powers, and next year it will have its first election by proportional representation and 96 members in the Senedd, which is a much more reasonable number of people in terms of the important role of lawmaking. But for me, it was the fact that we had the duty to promote sustainable development in everything that we did. And I didn't know about that when I was campaigning for the Assembly. It wasn't until I became Deputy Presiding Officer in the first year that I was like, gosh, what a brilliant duty. And then finding out that that duty wasn't in Scotland, and it wasn't in Northern Ireland, and it wasn't in England, it was only here in Wales. And that is directly attributable to Sue Essex, who in fact was a professor here in this university, and Cynnog Davis, so Sue from Labour and Cynnog from Plaid Cymru, put a proposal together in Parliament that the new National Assembly for Wales should have this particular duty. So in effect, the story starts with Sue and Cynnog, because of the fact that they, by putting this duty in, the duty to promote sustainable development in everything that we did, and then we had a cabinet from the second year under Rhodri Morgan, who was very, very keen. And any of you who've heard him speak will know that he was always speaking about his grandchildren, even when he didn't have them yet. But always this notion that everything we do in politics must serve current and future generations. We should be thinking for the long term. The very important sentence in the middle here is the Brundtland definition of sustainable development. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That, when I first discovered that sentence, it was agreed in 1987, it became the model of the UN at the first Earth Summit in 1992, and I didn't discover it until I became a member of the National Assembly for Wales. And it was one of those moments, and I'm afraid you're going to get quotes in my session today, because it was one of those moments for me when it's, that's it. That just tells us what we should be doing. It tells us the mind frame we should be in when we make our decisions. It tells us that we don't just think about the present, that we think about our effect on others. It tells us that we should be thinking positively about our effect on others, so not to make decisions now that will make it impossible for people in the future to meet their needs. So that, I suppose, that's the Davidson motto. It technically is the UN still fundamental proposition of all its work on the Sustainable Development Goals, but I'm not sure that many countries are really living up to that. The second element for Donella was you've got to have the vision, but also you can't do it on your own. Many people have visions in the privacy of their own houses. Sometimes they exercise those visions for good or bad in the privacy of their own houses. But unless you can kind of turn a moment into a movement, then you're not going to get anywhere with it. So what is a web of connections among equals, held together not by force, obligation, material incentive, or social contract, but by shared values and understanding. So this networking, finding other people who think that this is the right way to pursue decision making is absolutely critically important. And when I became the minister, first of all, as Tim was saying, I had the responsibility for all aspects of education, and then subsequently for all aspects of environment and sustainability. And in everything that we did inside the National Assembly, we relied hugely on these men and women who were giants in the sustainability movement, who had many, many different skills and were part of a commission that had been set up at the beginning of Tony Blair's win in 1997. And the point about that was the fact that they worked across the whole of the United Kingdom. So if you look at the politics, including of Northern Ireland, they worked for 6 different political parties in government in some combination or other across the different parts of the United Kingdom. And we relied very heavily on them because they looked across the world for best evidence and would give us all, as governments, best evidence of what was working for how we might take our agenda forward in Wales. And of course, we're starry-eyed, we've got no powers, but we've got lots of ideas, and we want to have a sustainable economy, promote good governance, use sound science responsibly, live within environmental limits, and have a strong, healthy and just society. And that was a key document from the Sustainable Development Commission, published in 2005, that worked for all parts of the United Kingdom, irrespective of their politics or culture. And I really picked this up. So I took on the ministerial responsibility in 2007, and working very closely with Sue Essex, who was the minister prior to me on the environment, and working very closely with Rhodri Morgan as our first minister. We'd already worked really closely together on introducing the foundation phase, for example. So we were including outdoor learning in everything that children did. My favourite headline was "Minister makes children play in the rain," and so we were already trying in areas where ministers were sympathetic, 'cause not all ministers were sympathetic. We were trying in those areas where ministers were sympathetic to try and include more and more of this approach in what we did. And in 2009, we published this document, One Wales, One Planet. We'd had consultation with thousands of people across Wales in small groups before this happened. And if you look at it, it's really interesting, because this was the 3rd scheme of the National Assembly. The duty to promote that I mentioned at the beginning required the government to have a scheme, and the first scheme was called Learning to Live Differently. And Pete was part of that one, I think, and Starting to Live Differently, working with Forum for the Future, another very important organisation in our early work. So Learning to Live Differently, Starting to Live Differently, and then this third one, One Wales, One Planet. But if you look at the language here, what you're seeing is language that has now been translated into the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And this is language that even when we did One Wales, One Planet, some of the language came from the people in Wales who we talked to about this vision and what they wanted to see. So living within environmental limits, that's planetary boundaries. And later, when we get to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, we find that a barrister for WWF told Welsh Government it was possible and gave a proposal for how that could be framed when the Welsh Government wasn't very keen on taking such a proposal forward. But is this not the kind of world that you might want to live in? You know, where it's healthy, biologically diverse, it lives within environmentals, it's resilient, sustainable economy, communities which are safe, sustainable and attractive, language which is virtually directly translated, as has a fair, just and bilingual nation. And we got a tremendously positive response to this proposal. And I also There's a lot of tributes I have to pay, because although I accept that I am the architect of the framework of the Act, I stand on the shoulders of absolute giants in all of this. I mean, the single most important person in One Wales, One Planet was probably Morgan Parry, who used to run WWF in Wales, who was absolutely passionate about this. Passionate Welsh speaker, passionate culturally, and saw the kind of culture element as critical in terms of how a country faces its sustainable challenge, something that became really important. And then when culture went into the 4 pillars underpinning the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, it's one of the things that most other countries in the world that are interested really like too. But then the sudden death of the Sustainable Development Commission is actually, in my story, probably the most significant thing that happened to me in terms of why we have a Future Generations Act. Because as Tim was saying, you know, I introduced the concept, a very, very Stalinist concept, it sounds, said back now, here we are in the 21st century, but of the fact that we would have sustainable development as our central organising principle of government. We voted it through cabinet, we gave it to the civil service, we expected them to act upon it, because after all, the civil service works with government on manifesto commitments, etc. And by now we're into the third assembly by this time, and therefore we are on manifesto commitments to take this forward. And then overnight, back in 2010, in came David Cameron and Nick Clegg, and they came in on a policy of 1 in, 1 out of non-departmental public bodies, NDPBs. Now, who knew that a policy which is about 1 in, 1 out, the first one it wiped out was the Sustainable Development Commission. So here we've had this body of people who, give so much to people of all political persuasions, have been welcomed by people of all political persuasions in all countries of the UK, wiped out overnight. And I was speaking at their 10th anniversary, and we were just told no minister would be attending and that they had been removed by the government. But it was kind of accidental. And I realised that there was no protection. It had just been set up as a policy commission. It had no protection in law. And so from somebody who'd been thinking that the biggest problem in Wales was getting the civil service to do what we'd asked them to do as a government, that we'd taken the cabinet resolutions, and other cabinet resolutions led to action, so why didn't this one, about making sustainable development the central organising principle? And we lost our main advisors. And literally, in the time it takes to get back from Bristol to Cardiff, I thought, right, we've got to now, we've got to have a law. And we've got to turn that duty to promote into a duty to deliver. So we would not have a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act without David Cameron and Nick Clegg. So unwilling participants perhaps, but definitely they get their particular moment in history on this one. So in the manifesto for 2011, because by this time I've already declared I'm leaving government, I'm off, or as I'm still there in fact, but I was then off to run a small holding in West Wales. And to then subsequently work as leading on sustainability in University of Wales, Trinity St David for nearly a decade. But in the manifesto, and the manifesto meeting took place about 3 weeks after the Sustainable Development Commission had been removed. So along I go to the Labour Party meeting where they're deciding the manifesto for the following May's election. And I put an emergency resolution on long-term thinking. And this was it. I proposed a sustainable Wales to become a one-planet nation by putting sustainable development at the heart of government, creating a resilient and sustainable economy that lives with its environmental limits, and only using our fair share of the Earth's resources to sustain our lifestyle. Now, most of you have just looked at that as well. I mean, when I said this to Labour Party members, they all just looked at me. And then somebody said, does Rhodri agree with this? And he said, absolutely. So it went through. It didn't get voted on because nobody opposed it. But everybody looked puzzled as to what, because of course if you haven't been living with this and all the twists and turns, unpicking most of those clauses is actually quite difficult. But therefore we got this emergency resolution through on long-term thinking, and that then meant that we could go into the next election when I could say goodbye to politics, and as a result and as a result of that, move forward into creating an act. But the other thing that I did was, of course, when the Sustainable Development Commission went, one of the people who had been so good for us in Wales, who was a Sustainable Development Commissioner, was a man called Peter Davis. And some of you will know Peter, absolute hero. And Peter lives in Wales, and was actually later hugely important in terms of the Act because he chaired the Wales Council for Voluntary Action. So the big Wales We Want initiative with thousands and thousands of people involved that was led by the Wales Council for Voluntary Action was led under Peter's leadership. And that was absolutely significant because that took place in 2014, just before the Act became law. But I took Peter on as a Sustainable Futures Commissioner in my office when the Sustainable Development Commission was removed. Because if we were going to have a law, I wanted somebody who understood from years of experience, who had all these connections across the world, to look at what a law could look like, could learn from others, find out who was doing the most exciting things about it. And of course, in many ways, that's why we in Wales, we have a commissioner, a statutory commissioner to do the role, because we piloted the idea of the commissioner in my office before I left politics. So then, at the next election, the new government announced there would be a legislation. They announced it in June 2011. Elections are always in May, or usually in May. And they legislated to embed sustainable development as that central organising principle in all our actions across government and public bodies. And so it was what we had tried to do politically, what we tried to do by instruction to the civil service. Now we actually had a legislative route, and to put in place a new independent sustainable development body for Wales, which is what became the Commissioner's Office. I must admit, I hoped at this time, I got terribly excited about this, and I thought that we might have that in the first year. I thought it would have been wonderful if it could have been done in the first year. And then we could have the whole of that administration, all the pieces of legislation would have been linked back to that. That was not to be, and looking back, I fully understand it. So that's what I wanted, but that's not in any way a complaint about the action the government did take. It was a minority government, therefore had to work with other parties in terms of doing this at all. And they had a number of more pressing matters that had to be dealt with in terms of their statutory functions. So this, in fact, became the last piece of legislation that was passed before the election that took place subsequently. Donnella's third element, so you've got visioning and networking. You know, having a clear vision that is for the good of humanity, developing a movement of people who will sign up to that vision, and then truth-telling. A system cannot function well if its information streams are corrupted by lies. Not unrelieved pessimism, not sappy optimism, but the resolve to tell the truth about both the successes and failures of the present and the potentials and obstacles of the future. And above all, the courage to admit and bear the pain of the present while keeping a steady eye on a vision for a better future. Now, this is an absolutely critical part of development of any legislation. And I think if we just go back now, because here we've got an incoming parliament. We're now down to, I think, 9 members who'd been in the original assembly at the time. So if we think about this point in 2011, where you've got a new parliament for the first time, lawmaking powers for the first time, you've got about 9 members of the original assembly. So a lot of the kind of history I've just told you has already gone in 2011. So if you think back about what didn't work about the existing arrangements, because that was really important in terms of what happened in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Now, we've dealt with the scheme requiring ministers to promote, not deliver. So in shorthand, I always say, that's what I did. I changed a word, but it changed everything, moving from promote to deliver. But there was no legal definition of sustainable development either. And you have to have legal definition if people are going to understand. So when I was saying that we thought by giving instructions to the civil service saying, we think you must be including sustainable development in everything you do, they go, what does it mean? You know, how should we do that, for example? So you do need to have a legal definition. And we also, very importantly, had the Audit Office report that showed in 2010 that it was not embedded in government practice. So 2010 was the big year for me in terms of looking at, well, audit has to be a critical part of the future of this. We have to have a legal definition of SD. We have to have a duty to deliver. And then the policy report from WWF found that it was not embedded across all portfolios. There was a lot of talk about it, but there were very few ministers that actually were looking at how to take this forward in a consistent way. Now, the 2014 conversation, and Michael Sheen was a very big part of that Peter Davis led from the Wales Council for Voluntary Action, was really important because it literally went into tiny valleys, into council estates, it went into gardening clubs, it went into all sorts of places. It talked to lots and lots of young people. Many thousands of young people took part in this national conversation in 2014 to influence what was included in what became the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And the really important aspect of that is it's their words that are used in the goals. So I always talk about the Act as something that is created for, with and by the people of Wales. I mean, yes, it's words that are brought together from different groups, etc., but it's not politicians' words. I showed you politicians' words at the beginning, and they don't resonate if you're going out to talk to your constituents. So the next aspect is, and I thought we might want to get into some of the truth-telling when we have a conversation. The fourth element for Donella was about learning. That once you've determined what the route is, you have to explore that path with vigour and courage. You have to be open to other people's exploration of other paths. You have to be willing to switch paths if one is found that leads more directly to the goal. And I think quite a lot of people have asked me over the years, well, why, why did you keep on doing this? Because quite often you think that, and universities are very good, apologies Wendy, but universities are very good saying about, we decided to do this here, and then here we are, we've done it. And yet there's something which, when I did my contributions in Harvard, I fell in love with what they call the Harvard squiggle. And the Harvard squiggle is effectively, you decide here, and then this person leaves. So there's a big trough. And then you get an absolute star comes in, and then it goes right up here, and everything's going really well. And then there's a corruption scandal in the department. So the idea has to go on the back burner for a bit because it can't be associated with that person. And then it goes down a trough because everybody's forgotten about it. And then in comes a new PhD, and they pick it up again, and the time is right, and it all happens. And the story is, we started here and we finished here. And all those bits in the middle get cut out. But I feel that my life has been like that in terms of this act, because it was really, really hard. It was hard to persuade people to do it. It was hard, although there were always, can I say, huge numbers, hundreds of people who were incredibly supportive of this, and really fantastic organisations which were incredibly helpful, but really hard to institutionalise this because it is counter-cultural. And I think that notion about learning, that taking the path with vigour and courage, being strong because it's the right thing to do, being willing to switch paths if necessary, such as when the Sustainable Development Commission disappeared, suddenly the path had to be a law. And that was not even in my thoughts the morning of that event. So always having something in your back pocket as well for something that you really believe needs to happen. And I think that most people here, I'm sure, know of the Act, but just in very simple terms, it is a duty to deliver. You have to deliver a number of things. You have to take account of society, environment, economy and culture. So our legislation in Wales is an Eisteddfod chair of legislation. It's a really solid base by having culture as well, one of the things that most attracts other countries. It has those 7 goals, and they're linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. That was another, I kept being called in to try and help the process along when I was in the university because people were getting a bit stuck about what they were trying to do with the legislation. And sort of just, well, could we go back to first principles just to have a chat about that? And it was really clear that people wanted to deliver something that was meaningful. And I think the Act is incredible, and the Act was delivered not by me, but by the Parliament at the time, in fact, by all parties. Because although not all parties supported it when it became law, all parties had contributed to the amendments, often deliberate sort of wrecking style amendments that ended up making the Act stronger as well. But the Act here has those 7 goals in the middle, 4 pillars on the right-hand side, and then these 5 really important ways of working. And I still believe that these are the ones that will deliver on the Act if we can really get our heads around them. If you have to think long-term in every decision that you take, if you have to think preventatively, if you have to think collaboratively, if you have to integrate outcomes and you have to involve people about whom decisions are being made, you make different decisions. And all those democratic kind of opportunities that have been taken through assemblies and juries and collaborative initiatives between governments and the people, all those sorts of initiatives have found that it changes decision making when you are inclusive. So I think that these 5 ways of working, which I had nothing to do with, are absolutely brilliant. I think adding culture as to the 4th leg of the sustainable development that used to be a stool and now it's a proper chair in Wales, I had nothing to do with that. The 7 goals, I had nothing to do with that either. So why am I standing in front of you? And these goals are laid out in law as well. And that's laid out on the face of the Act in law. And that's a really, really important point, because that question about, well, what does sustainable development look like? It looks like delivering on the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, because that's the principle behind the Act. And then in each of these goals, it looks like these definitions, which are in front of you. And all the public services, including the Welsh Government, all the public services accountable to the Welsh Government, including the Welsh Government, are accountable to under this Act. And we'll go on in a moment just to give you a chance to have a read of that if you don't know these words. We'll go on to look at the accountability. Okay? Now this is my bit. So from my perspective, as somebody who'd been the minister, it had to be a law, because the way in which organisations are audited means that the Auditor General has huge influence over what organisations do. So for me, the Auditor General had to have a responsibility to audit the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in organisations. But organisations also need a critical friend. So they have the Future Generations Commissioner, who has some powers of naming and shaming and can hold special reviews in partnership or without partnership with organisations. But that person's primary role is to be a critical friend and draw attention to good practice and advise government and public services on the way that they should act. And the other element that I input was about it must be linked to a global definition of sustainable development, the Brundtland definition, and to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, so that whatever we do in Wales could potentially be replicated in another country. Not replicated in the sense that a country might want to do it differently, but actually, if you think about the components now, strong accountability mechanisms, very clear frameworks, duty to deliver, linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, it's potentially something which any other country in the world, or which is particularly those which are members of the UN, would be potentially interested in looking at. And there are over 40 countries. In fact, if we think about regional governments or we think about organisations, I've had about 60 in contact with me over the last 3 or 4 years since the book came out, wanting to discuss how to take this philosophy forward in their own country. The regulatory reviews happen every year. And this is, and particularly the year before an election. So the Auditor General wrote his report, No Time to Lose, and the Future Generations Commissioner wrote his report, which you can see here, where he has identified 4 areas: implementation and impact mission, climate and nature, health and well-being, and culture and Welsh language, as part of a major initiative to look at framing the laws of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act into the absolute core of Welsh life. So these reports, for anybody interested in the development of the Act and what might happen subsequently, are really important reading. They're produced a year before the election so that an incoming government of whatever political persuasion can actually look at this and make its decisions on the basis of which elements it might or might not want to take forward. Donnella's final kind of advice in terms of how you win the debate is about loving. And I must admit, I found it quite hard to talk about loving as a concept in governance. Americans do it quite easily, and actually so do Europeans. So I've learned to love talking about loving. But loving as a concept, which is a collective transformation that permits the best of human nature rather than the worst to be expressed and nurtured. Isn't that wonderful? And so, in talking about loving, she was talking about the fact that you don't win these debates by hate. You don't win these debates through attacks. You don't win these debates by othering people, by blaming people who are blameless in the context of a political narrative. You win these debates by getting the largest number of people from the widest number of backgrounds to think that it's important to create a life that is positive for humanity, for the future. And our mandate, some of you will have heard me, because I've spoken in this university before, so I wasn't going to talk in detail about this. But this was a joint commission through Labour and Plaid Cymru when they had a cooperation agreement in 2021. And I was asked to pull together a challenge group of people to look at how we could accelerate the delivery of net zero in a just and nature positive way. Very happy to do that, I said, provided we do it all according to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is what we did. And we couldn't be more grateful to the Wales Centre for Public Policy, which is here, because the Welsh Government commissioned publications from the Wales Centre for Public Policy on the most up-to-date academic evidence, and they're really, really good reports, where we wanted to look obviously at the big emission reduction areas, so that was in buildings and transport and energy and food. We wanted to look explicitly at education and the future of work, but we also wanted to look at the whole issue about adaptation and impact, because I've been worried for a long time that people who've wanted to mitigate climate change will often not listen to the people who realise that we also still have to adapt a lot in terms of making sure that we keep populations safe. And for me, that's the job of government. Not keeping populations safe as in a defence approach, but keeping populations safe as in because we love our population and we want to do the best for them. That seems to me a very simple principle of governance that works. So we published our 7 reports last year. The transition to net zero was the report that looks at particularly at the kind of adaptation issues and all the issues around risk as well, because there are so many decisions that we take where we don't actually think about the risk of consequent on those decisions. And what we laid out were, rather than recommendations, because in my last week in government, I think we as a cabinet had 3,000 recommendations. So when you think of writing recommendations for ministers, just think again, because everybody writes recommendations to ministers. But what we tried to do is we've laid out delivery pathways which have now been explored by Welsh Government officials and others. And we will see how effective or otherwise we have been in the context of the Welsh carbon budget, which will be published by the end of this year. But a lot of the big climate and nature campaigns in Wales have picked up our work, and there's a day on the 17th of September when they want to do a mass lobby of the parliamentarians, the Senedd members, when they're back, about acting as though this was an emergency. And I just wanted to finish with a few quotes, which I just feel to me as though they say something different, each one, and they may or may not mean something to you. I'm as good as my last good quote, I have to say. I'm one of those people. So you're getting my favourite ones here, although you'll notice that a couple of them are fiction. But anyway, this one I never go out without saying this, because John Rawls' theory of justice, and a poet and a philosopher, American, but just do unto future generations as you would have had past generations do unto you. And I think that those of us, you will hear a lot about my generation being the most privileged generation, because we grew up after the war. And after the war, a lot of decisions that were taken, deliberate decisions to give us a health service, an education service, to build council housing, to create national parks, to clean up water, etc., etc. You know, there was a real shake-up in society, and the answer was a government that wanted to look after its people. And it's hard to say that we're in that situation now. And then I just love this. I mean, Hilary Mantel is one of my favourite writers, but you know, when you're writing laws, you're testing words to find their utmost power. Like spells, they have to make things happen in the real world, and like spells, they only work if people believe in them. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Even though now we've dealt with all those issues about having definitions, having a legislative framework, having both an audit mechanisms, SDG mechanisms, having court mechanisms, etc., having a commissioner to help, having the UN at their Summit for the Future last year, in September last year, signing up a pact for the future that included a recommendation for an envoy very akin to the commissioner role in Wales. Despite all those things, you've got to believe in it. You've got to believe that this is worth fighting for. And I just feel that we're in such a strange environment at the moment with where politics is going, that I think this is probably a stronger moment. And what's interesting is, I've noticed that, you know, I was sort of hovering about 6,000 followers on LinkedIn, and then in came Trump. I have over 12,000 followers now, like literally doubled in the last few months. And I think a lot of that is people going, actually, this future generations narrative is a narrative that can play for all political parties. Because I always think about, you know, the oldest person I know and love is my mum. She's in a care home in Cardiff, and her memory is not what it used to be, and she's 95. And my youngest is my little granddaughter, Stevie. And Stevie has just started school. She's 4. But between them is me, and between all of us is 200 years. So when we're talking about decisions for the long term, we're not talking about decisions that are for people you don't know. We're talking about decisions for people we know and love. And that's the importance about this being part of loving, is that I want good decisions taken about my mum's healthcare, and I want equally good decisions to give Stevie as good a life as my mum, or me, or even better if possible. But I think at the moment I'm happy to go, if she can have as good a life as I have, then actually she'll have a bloody brilliant life. So, you know, we've got to really fight for this at the moment. So this is Robin Williams. No, each and every one of us in this room is one day going to stop breathing, turn cold and die. Carpe diem. Seize the day. Make your lives extraordinary. And then another one of my absolute heroes, the woman who created the kind of green wall, who's done so much in terms of afforestation, whose daughter has now taken this on from her. I met her at the COP in Copenhagen and was absolutely starstruck. And she said then, this is actually from 2009, and this was when we were hoping that Copenhagen would give us the climate deal that we wanted. In the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called to shift to a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground, a time when we have to shed our fear and give hope to each other, and that time is now. So thanks so much for listening. The last quote is the oldest one. Avo ben bid bont. If you want to be a leader, be a bridge. We do say it very well in Wales. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.